let me start with some of the updates and announcements before we get into the substance of the live. As you know, Live with Matt goes out on Substack a few days afterwards. It goes out on our YouTube a few days afterwards. We just hit 75,000 people on YouTube, which is great. So if you're not part of our channel, do go and hit like and subscribe. And after that, it becomes available on Spotify and Apple. But our founding paid, most committed supporters get everything well before everybody else. They're here on the Friday, going live with the discussion. The other thing to say, we have only 10 places left at the Christmas party on December the 14th. Almost all of the tickets went within, I think, a few hours. We have 10 left, just to flag that. Now onto the live. What we're going to be talking about today, the Labour budget. Just some thoughts about that. The Southport revelations, I just want to share some thoughts about that. A national campaign, which is starting today. Some really big news around that. Some latest polling numbers in the US, just give a thought as to what I think might happen on Tuesday, and some of the small boat numbers in the UK. There's a lot to get through. We've got the most popular question as always, but then we'll come to everybody for questions after that. So let me start with the Labour budget. As usual, I'll talk for about 15 minutes, give some thoughts that I've not shared already. Let me just work through the list of topics and hopefully some of it will be of use to you. So on the Labour budget, what I think essentially is that what we're seeing is a continuation of a big state, big tax, big regulation, big debt, big borrowing, and big immigration economy. The increases in tax rates to the highest ever level on record, tax take as a share, the tax burden, if you like, is now going to go up to 38%. It's never been that high. That's a record. And our borrowing is now going to go up enormously. And that borrowing is going to be very, very expensive in terms of paying it back. It will be our children and their children who are paying that borrowing. And I think what we've seen is Rachel Reeves and Labour really using things like the national insurance employers tax increase to try and invest in public services that are going to continue to deteriorate for reasons that I'm going to come back to. But what they've done essentially is clobbered businesses by raising the national insurance employer tax. I spent the last 48 hours listening to one business after another saying, well, as the Institute for Fiscal Studies has shown, about 3/4 of that tax rise on businesses is going to be passed on to workers in terms of reduced wages and deteriorating conditions. So this budget is going to smash working people, no matter what the Labour Party really says about it. And we're going to take out an enormous amount of borrowing to what Labour say will be an investment strategy, but it's going to deliver no real growth. And if you look at the forecasts that have come with this budget, at the end of the 5-year period, we're going to have growth rates of about 1.5%. So we are very much staying in a big state, big debt, low growth economy. One of the things Rachel Reeves and Labour didn't mention, which I mentioned online, is also the extent to which this budget said nothing at all about how those public services and the capacity of the state is also being undermined and weakened by Labour's extreme policy of mass uncontrolled immigration. That wasn't mentioned at all. So we're raising taxes and we're increasing borrowing partly to try and turn around deteriorating public services like the National Health Service, schools, infrastructure, while not talking at all about the population strategy in this country, which is quite obviously piling pressure on all of those public services and deteriorating those public services further. There was no real discussion about that at all. Now, if you look at the detail of the budget, which I spent, whenever it was Wednesday evening, reading through the detail, The other interesting thing is the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, is assuming that from here onwards, net migration will stay at 315,000 per annum, which is about half of what it is at the moment. So I don't think even their migration estimates are particularly accurate either. Just away from the migration thing, though, what are we going to see? Look, I said before Labour was elected that this government would be one of the most unpopular governments we've ever seen because of the macro fiscal economic environment. But I didn't think they would be this unpopular this quickly. So the markets are already losing confidence. We can see the gilt yields and the cost of borrowing are now pretty much where they were when Liz Truss had her mini budget, pretty much. Been rising for about 5-6 months, not just since the budget. So we're going to have a very weak economic environment. Taxes are going to go up. We're going to see police officers, senior nurses dragged into higher rates of tax. Local council tax bills have already gone up. And we're going to be spending billions of pounds every year on this enormous pile of debt. About 99% of our debt to GDP ratio is about 99%. It's enormous amounts of debt, partly because of COVID, also because of the war in Ukraine, both of which, by the way, the Labour Party signed off on. You know, so they can blabber on about a £22 billion black hole. They signed off on a lot of the big investments or the big decisions, if you like, that were made in the UK economy. On top of that, we've got a very unpopular Prime Minister. Keir Starmer's leadership rating is now minus 38. I mean, I joked a couple of weeks ago that he was in Prince Harry territory. He genuinely is now in Prince Andrew territory. I mean, this guy is incredibly unpopular. I always said he would be. I mean, he has absolutely no charisma. He has no vision for the country. He doesn't seem to understand the country. I'd even go further. I don't think he even likes the country. I mean, he genuinely appears to dislike the people in the country who do not share his values. And I don't think there's much of a vision here. So think about the things Labour haven't talked about in this budget. Nothing about productivity, just given away public sector pay increases without asking for much in return at all. Haven't talked at all about how we're going to increase GDP per capita. Talk about growth. Okay, fine. Talk about growth rates, 1%. Look at the OBR detail. What it shows very clearly, it says once you adjust for Britain's rising population, our GDP per capita, meaning basically growth per person, is declining, is basically going backwards. Now, why is that? Well, for all of the reasons I've been writing on the Substack now for over a year, that's what happens when you basically build a Deliveroo economy. So you're flooding the economy with low-wage, low-skill workers. You're not incentivizing business to innovate. You're not incentivizing businesses to be dynamic. You're giving them an endless supply of cheap, often migrant labor. At the same time, big global corporations have been offshoring a lot of those jobs to other countries. So ordinary working people are getting smashed on two sides. They're getting smashed by this kind of globalized, deregulated regime where global corporations have no real loyalty to the national community, but they're also now getting clobbered by the influx of cheap migrant workers that businesses are using to keep costs as low as possible, profits high, and to stop investing in their workforce and becoming more dynamic. You know, the evidence is there for that. I just think it's absolutely outrageous. I'm surprised as well at the extent to which Labour ministers themselves look very muted about the budget. You know, they clearly can sense that they are not connecting with the country. So, look, people aren't buying it. Only 17% of Brits today felt they're going to get richer, they're going to get more prosperous in the years ahead. The vast majority of Brits basically believe the economy is going to get worse, which unfortunately, I don't want to be too gloomy, but it is going to get worse. I mean, it is going to get weaker. We are going to see a deterioration in our public services. And, you know, there's something else tucked away here that the IFS, Paul Johnson, I don't agree with everything the IFS says, but he's a good guy. He knows his stuff. He said more tax rises are probably going to have to come in next year in order to cover public service cuts that have already been factored into our national finances. So the tax rises that we've seen, my bet is they're not going to be the last tax rises that we see. I just want to move on, because I'm conscious of time, to Southport and the revelations that we were given this week, because I think this was a really important moment in British politics. So, look, I'm going to tell you a bit about something that's going to blow up today. You're the first people in the country to know about this. Okay, so this is one of the advantages of coming live with us. I was not surprised by the revelations in Southport. I had already basically suggested that this case was clearly about, for many people in the country, this was about the effects of mass immigration, broken borders, and was probably going to be linked in some way or other to radical Islamism. Now, what we've discovered, interestingly, just ahead of the budget, a major fiscal event, just ahead of the US election, a major global event, what we discovered, you might say in news that was maybe sneaked out, is that the guy who's accused of murdering those poor little girls had downloaded an Al Qaeda and had attempted to make ricin a biological weapon. Yet the attacks are not being treated as a terrorist incident. As I wrote yesterday, I think this is absolutely outrageous. I think the information would have been made known to both Labour Prime Minister Keir Starmer and Home Secretary Yvette Cooper. In fact, there's a piece in the Telegraph, I tweeted it out this morning. A counterterrorism expert says Yvette Cooper, he thinks, would have known within hours that this case had involved a biological weapon such as ricin. And, maybe not within hours, but certainly not within the last few weeks. I don't find that convincing on any level whatsoever. So I went very public yesterday. We had 2 days ago, we had a very big viral video watched by hundreds of thousands of people. I said, I want some questions answered. I want to know when Keir Starmer knew about this information, when Yvette Cooper knew about this information. I want to know why this information was not released to the British public. We're clearly being managed by a state or authorities that are, for whatever reason, not giving people the truth. I don't buy the idea pushed by many lawyers on X over the last 48 hours that this is part of an ordinary investigation. Why not? Because in previous terrorist attacks, take the guy that drove his van into a mosque, it took them 8 minutes to decide that was a terrorist incident. It took people in much of the media class about 8 minutes to make that determination, and now we're suddenly being asked to wait months and months and months. It just doesn't feel right to me. There's something going on here, and I'm not going to stop asking questions about it. And what I said in the piece yesterday, Southport is a symbol of a bigger issue, which gets me to the national campaign we're about to launch. Southport was about blaming Brits for misinformation while not sharing information with them, right? This is a device, a trick that is used to basically control the public square and the national conversation, okay? But this isn't just about this case. As you know, if you've been reading the pieces over the last few weeks, people are not given arrest data by nationality and immigration status. They're not given imprisonment data. They're not given reoffending data. They're not given tax credit data. They're not given welfare claims data. They're not given housing and accommodation data. Now, this is not about just being hostile to the idea of immigration, right? But this is about transparency and telling it straight and being honest with people about how this political project is impacting the world around them. Denmark makes this data available. Germany, France, other countries, Sweden, they've been starting to collect and make this data available. The state and the British authorities are not. So what I'm doing today, you're going to see it, keep tabs on X, keep tabs on Twitter, there'll be a stack later on today, is we're launching a national campaign signed off by Reform MPs, all 5 of them, and we are now demanding that the British state, that British authorities, that Labour Prime Minister Keir Starmer, that Home Secretary Yvette Cooper, that the Treasury and the civil service start treating the British people with the respect and decency they deserve by collecting this information and sharing it, or releasing this information if they already have it. Okay, so the pedal's going down today. I'm often asked by people in emails, well, what are we doing to make a difference? We've already changed laws in this country. We've delivered things like the Higher Education Free Speech Act. We've done a number of things in this community. But this point about data is critical. It might seem a bit nerdy to you. If we get the data and information, the whole case for this project will start to collapse, right? Because what we see in other countries is that the exact model that is being used by our political class is bringing net fiscal costs. Crime rates are much higher, particularly sexual assault and rape, by the way, among asylum seekers, illegal migrants coming into Western states. I want to throw light on this. So what we've done is we've drawn together MPs. We got a letter. We've also got some brand new polling of the British people. I'm going to share with you today some of the findings. We've done polling of a representative sample of British adults. This will all be going out today. I asked people, do you want to have available arrest rates in the UK by nationality of birth and immigration status? 57% of Brits say, yes, I want that data. Do you want data on the sentencing of foreign nationals and repeat offending? 67% of Brits say, yeah, I want that data. Do you want tax credits and tax information by nationality and immigration status? 57% of Brits say, yeah, I want that data. Tax contributions, housing and accommodation costs, it's the same story. This is a majority position. As usual, this is a majority position. You're led to believe this is fringe, right? You're led to believe this isn't actually what people want. That's completely inaccurate. It is exactly what a majority of people, the forgotten majority in this country, want to see. And I'm not going to stop talking about it until we get the data. So what you're going to see is the campaign launch. We're going to be cascading this across all of our social media. All of that is possible. It's only possible because of your support. So the only thing really that is allowing this to happen is that I'm able to hire Archie and our social media guys, and we're able to cascade this and behind the scenes working with MPs to make sure this gets out. So if you see this campaign, help us, support it, share it. We're going to ask people to send this letter to their local MPs, and, let's go. I just want to move on to the US. I'm conscious of time. So look, this is our last live before the election, or is it? Because what we're also going to do on Tuesday, we're going to have an election eve live where we're going to talk about, as we're preparing to watch the US election results come in. I don't know if any of you are going to do an all-nighter. I will be doing an all-nighter. I won't be going live at 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. when we start to get Michigan and Pennsylvania and so on. But we will be going live at some point on Tuesday evening, just as the energy and anticipation is starting to build up, to look at the final polls. Now, if you look at the polling today, depending on who your favorite pollster is, if you take like a real clear politics average, and I appreciate we've got pollsters on this live who will point out that some of these companies that take an average of the polls, they don't differentiate between high quality pollsters and more medium, low quality pollsters. Real Clear Politics just takes an average of everything. Now, if you look at the latest numbers, Trump is slightly ahead, including in most of the swing states, but all of that is within the margin of error. And of course, the margin of error in polling is a lot bigger in those swing states. They're kind of harder to poll. But he's certainly in a much stronger position than he was in both 2020 and 2016. He's looking particularly strong in some of the crunch states that I think will end up making a difference. Kamala Harris has been focusing everything on the blue wall. Obviously, she's focusing on Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. I think Trump looks very competitive in those states. Whether Joe Biden's garbage comment is going to make a difference, whether this Puerto Rico comment is going to hurt the Republicans, I don't think at this point much of that is going to make a difference. I think the fundamentals are priced in. My gut instinct is still saying Trump's probably going to end up getting this over the line, but it is literally now a coin toss. I mean, I would not be surprised if we end up with Harris winning, which would be an interesting presidency, let's put it like that. But I would not be surprised at all if it's a clean sweep and Trump ends up not just winning the popular vote, but actually ends up winning the White House and takes the Senate and the House. I mean, I would not be at all surprised by a clean sweep in that sense either. I think the campaign has also underlined where the Tories have been weak in Britain, in that Trump has stayed very strongly connected to the groups that Conservatives in Britain have lost. You will have read our piece on Zoomer men voting for Trump and why they are. There's a bit of a debate among pollsters about whether Zoomer men are more likely than they were in the past to vote for Trump, but he's doing much better among African American voters, Hispanic, Latino voters. He's doing really well among working class voters, non-graduates, all the people who turned out for Boris Johnson in 2019, and then the Tories really treated with contempt and didn't bother to give them what they wanted. So if Trump wins, I think the message for conservatives across much of the West is going to be pretty clear, that the realignment is definitely alive and well and is worth focusing on. So let's see how that goes. And just lastly, before I come to the questions, Archie pointed out to me, we're tracking the numbers on the small boats in the UK. But Archie pointed out to me that this week is the week in which the number of small boat arrivals are now greater than the number throughout all of 2023. This shouldn't surprise us. We've talked on this Substack about why Labour's plan is bonkers. It's not going to work. Smashing the gangs isn't going to make a difference. We explain that in our documentary as well, How to Stop the Invasion. Unless you're going to leave the ECHR, reform the Human Rights Act, and have an active deterrent, this crisis is going to rumble on. And it's a bloody expensive crisis as well. Nick Timothy, Conservative MP, former advisor to Theresa May, had a really interesting exchange with Yvette Cooper recently in the House, where he pointed out that what Labour are doing, very clever, they are basically giving the right to remain to tens of thousands of asylum seekers and illegal migrants, and then they're basically trying to hide the costs of that in the welfare system. Nick is estimating the cost of this, of one cohort of illegal migration, is around £18 billion. About £18 billion is the figure. So the budget, Rachel Reeves can say, well, we're saving $2 billion by scrapping Rwanda, and we're trying to stop the hotels, which now they're reopening. I mean, it's all nonsense. If you actually look at the overall cost of this broken system, it's upwards of $7 billion a year. And then, as I say, the cost of these cohorts of illegal migrants is just absolutely astronomical. So the small boat crisis is going to intensify and accelerate. Legal migration is going to stay very high. Growth is going to stay very low. Public services are going to remain very stretched, because we're not talking about the population explosion. We're not talking about the fact that between now and 2036, this is the government's own forecast. Okay, this isn't me making this up. The government's forecast shows that between today and 2036, another 6.5 million people will be arriving and settling in the UK. 6.5 million, okay, in 12 years. So that is basically 3/4 of London in 12 years. So I've talked about this on the Stack a lot. This is what we call the population trap, where the capacity of the state to provide public services is overtaken by the scale of population change. So the state can no longer basically provide basic public services, okay? Now, that's why Justin Trudeau has just come out in Canada and said, I'm not going to continue with this policy of mass migration, because even, the captain of woke has realized that actually this policy makes zero sense when it comes to housing, education, welfare. They just can't keep up with the pace of change. I hope our leaders would recognize the same thing. I don't think they will, because for Labour, this is a religion. I think pro-immigration has become a religion for these people. You can't even question it. You can't even challenge it. But those numbers, the pace of change, they're going to pile so much pressure on the NHS, schools, housing. I think inevitably the tax rises that we've seen are just the start of a new regime of high tax, big state. John asked the most popular question this week. How can we combat being called far right when all we want to do is control our national borders and have free speech? Question I hear a lot, not least as I debated Nick Robinson and Mehdi Hassan, and was accused of far-right Islamophobia, as I pointed out that the case in Southport probably had something to do with radical Islamism. And Mehdi Hassan's brain exploded and basically said, well, that's Islamophobic. Nick Robinson essentially said, well, this reminds me of Enoch Powell in 1968. I mean, you cannot have a serious discussion about these issues with contemporary liberals. They've just gone off a cliff. They're not interested in having a serious evidence-based discussion. What I would say, as I've often said on the Stack, is I point out to people that the things that you're talking about, John, controlling national borders, lowering migration, supporting free speech, are majority supported issues in this country. About 70%, 75% want to lower migration. The vast majority want to stop illegal migration. Large majorities are supportive of free speech and free expression. So if I'm far right or you're far right, the country's far right, I mean, in essence. And that's reflecting a tactic that is used to try and shut down debate about these issues. And we're seeing the expansion of social norms like far right, Islamophobic, hate, and that is used to try and control the parameters of the national conversation, but is also used to discredit people who challenge the dominant status quo. Michael Lind, you might be familiar with Michael's work. He wrote a very good book called The New Class War, which I'd recommend, came out a few years ago. And Michael makes the argument that deriding voters as garbage, as deplorables, cranks and loons, you remember the infamous exchange between Gordon Brown and Gillian Duffy. Anybody who voices concern over free movement is a bigot. Partly this reflects an attempt to control conversation and shut people down. Far-right thugs was the latest example of that in the aftermath of the riots and the protests. But actually, it also reflects how many liberals think about these issues. And one of the most read pieces recently was the piece we did on liberal authoritarians. The fascinating study by Luke Conway, who's a psychologist, very esteemed academic. And Luke Conway made the argument that if there is a subset of people within, you might call it the liberal left, let's say radical progressives, you're thinking of the Emily Maitlasses, the James O'Briens, the Mehdi Hassans, maybe the Nick Robinsons, but the view is sort of almost incapable of processing and accepting evidence that challenges their ideological priors, their beliefs. And you see this all the time, right? This kind of sort of glazed look when they're presented with evidence that might challenge this religion. It's a religion for people. And what Conway argued is it's not just that a section of the liberal left exhibit this authoritarian mindset, that they're more prone to rigid thinking than conservatives. He said they're more prone than conservatives to wanting to basically destroy their opponents, to shut down, to crush their political opponents. Alistair Campbell's a great example of this. Alistair Campbell is like the living, breathing liberal authoritarian. Great example of this. Cannot tolerate any discussion or debate that goes against his priors. Overwhelmed with narcissism. Everything is about, my story, my problems, and everybody must basically be forced to go along with the Alistair Campbell view of the world. Classic liberal authoritarian. And James O'Brien is another. So what I point out to those people is at best they represent 15% of the country, max, like at best. The forgotten majority on all of these issues are exactly where I would argue this Substack is. And that is why I can just say personally, I made a conscious decision to go round the elite class and actually build a community with ordinary people, because numerically that community is 10 times bigger, and with size comes power. But let's move on to some of the other questions that we've got. What's happening with Kamala's word salad? Is she as nuts as Biden? Kamala Harris should not be president of the United States. She's massively overqualified. She's the weakest presidential candidate I've seen in my lifetime. Her closing argument was the same old liberal catastrophizing that we've heard since 2016. This kind of, America's on the cusp of fascism, of a sort of Nazi-style takeover. And look, the best argument I've heard about Harris and Trump, and I linked to it on the last stack on the election, was by Michael Gurry, who said, look, whatever you think about Harris and Trump, what this election ultimately about is an election between people that want to control pretty much every facet of our national life. They want to censor social media. They want to dominate the institutions. They want to control the parameters of our national conversation. They want to impose non-crime hate incidents. They want to deride much of the rest of the country who don't share their values as bigots and gammons. And as John Gray argued in the New Statesman, they want to use rhetoric like culture wars to basically force you to go along with this 15% project, versus people who refuse to be controlled, who want to live their life without being regulated, without being subjected to top-down control, who want to preserve a free marketplace of ideas, who might really dislike Donald Trump, but ultimately, on balance, they want to live in a world where they are free from the controllers, which is why they're liberators, why I call them liberators. And I think that fault line around control helps to make sense of a lot of things we're seeing recently. Take the Labour strategy to kill Twitter or X, which we've seen, an alliance between Labour activists and Democrats, Kamala Harris strategists and Labour strategists, to basically try and control the public square. That is what it is. We saw Ofcom yesterday fine GB News £100,000 for apparently presiding over a sort of biased debate with Rishi Sunak. I was at that debate. It was a public questioning of Rishi Sunak during the election campaign. It was a grilling. It was not easy for Rishi Sunak. He was openly criticised. He was lampooned by the public. Keir Starmer was offered the very same event. He was offered to debate the public. He declined. I would suspect because he saw how difficult a time Rishi Sunak had. Yet Ofcom have given GB News £100,000 fine. At the same time as Ed Balls, former Labour MP, is interviewing his wife on Good Morning Britain and interviewing Rachel Reeves, another Labour MP, yet this is somehow considered to be acceptable. Like, if you don't see the bias and you don't see the way in which regulators are trying to control the public square, right, then you're not looking at all. And I think it's pretty outrageous. Do I think farming is at a crisis? Absolutely. One of the awful things in the budget was the inheritance tax change, which is basically going to put many family farms out of business. Why is this? Because Labour doesn't really give a toss about rural communities. It doesn't value the little platoons, the relationship that we have with the countryside. That is part of the reason as to why we are a national community. It is a rootedness to the English countryside that is fundamentally part of Englishness. The Labour Party has never fully appreciated that. It doesn't really understand that. Labour is now more than ever a party of urban elite liberal graduates. It just doesn't understand the importance of generational legacy, the importance of rural communities, of preserving our countryside. That is what makes us an us. And I was very disheartened to see the farming changes that were brought in. So yeah, absolutely, farming is in a moment of crisis. Does this government have a policy of impoverishing the country to impose the socialist hegemony? Trevor, you know what, Trevor, I think a lot of this is just incompetence. I think the Labour government is one of the most inexperienced governments that we've had in a very long time. Most of the people on the front bench have no business experience. They've never run a company, built a company. They don't really understand how the economy works. The national insurance tax rise was a clear example of that. So Labour are bringing in employee rights legislation designed to bolster the position of workers, while encouraging, incentivizing businesses to undermine the position of workers in order to offset new taxes introduced by Labour. Like, it's insane. It doesn't make any sense at all. I think this government is already showing itself, Trevor, to be more radical than even I accepted. In the space of a few months, we've seen the mainstreaming of debates over slavery reparations. We've seen this kind of utterly boring, insidious, divisive identity politics come out. I don't give a monkey's if we've got a female chancellor and she's the first female chancellor in our history. I want a competent chancellor, and I don't care if the chancellor's blue, pink, female, male, whatever. I want a chancellor that can actually run the British economy. And somewhere along the line, Labour became so utterly invested in identity politics, it just forgot about competency and is now paying the price. I just don't think it's a competent government. And somebody's asked here, how could we have a new election without waiting 5 years? Very, very difficult, right? Unlikely to happen. What's going to happen now is this government is going to become so unpopular, as it already is. It's going to hunker down. It's going to use this enormous majority to basically fend off as much as it can challenges to its power. There might be some internal squabbling within the Labour Party, but I think overall, when in power, Labour has shown itself to be more disciplined than the Conservatives in terms of trying to fend off internal squabbles. At best, we might get a leadership change before 28, 29, but obviously that won't change the fundamentals, which is why the only thing that matters now, the only thing that can matter, are the only elections that we have. Local elections, Welsh Assembly elections, by-elections, and trying to change the national debate. Tomorrow. The assumption I'm working on is if you care about this country, you want to see this country move in a very different direction, we basically have 3 years, 4 years to build a vibrant alternative to the big parties. We basically have a vibrant, I think sounds back, Archie? Sound back, guys? Yeah. So we have about 3 years, 4 years to build an alternative to the two big parties. That's why I don't really care about who wins the Conservative leadership contest. In some respects, I don't really think it's that relevant. I suspect Kemi will win, but I don't think it really matters. It's very obvious where I think a lot of people are investing their energy and time, which is trying to apply pressure on the big parties and see how far that pressure can go ahead of 28, 29. I don't think, there's any prospect of opposition to Labour becoming so fragmented that Labour are just going to walk it in the next election. I don't think people are going to allow that to happen. But it is also true that there is now a unique 3-year, 4-year window to try and build something that better represents ordinary British people. Now, if that works, great, wonderful. I know I'm going to play my bit. I suspect lots of other people will play their bit. But if it doesn't work, then, I have to see where the Conservative Party goes. If we're going to receive 6.5 million people coming into the country by 2036, mainly young men, where are the plans to build 3 million new homes in addition to the existing new homes, and where? Well, amen, exactly. So the government's building around 180,000 homes a year at the moment in England and Wales. On current estimates, we need to build somewhere around 550,000 homes to keep up with demand. On top of that, we've now got growing competition from illegal migrants and asylum seekers who, as we've learned this morning, I've just put this story on X, are now being moved out of temporary accommodation into council houses and rented accommodation that is undercutting local British people, which is, again, outrageous. The housing crisis is going to accelerate and intensify over the next 5 to 10 years unless we, A, have a big house building program, and B, dramatically curtail and limit and lower the overall level of migration into the country. Those are the two things essentially that have to be done. Now, there's also a story which has been buried in the news, but I'm about to share it on social media this afternoon on X. From Kent, a county I know well. I was at the university for many years, where Kent councils say because of the demands that are now coming from the illegal migration crisis, they can't even provide basic services to local children and families, which again is just absolutely outrageous, because what you've got are lots of local councils that are near bankruptcy or are bankrupt, trying to provide core public services and then being asked to suddenly find and make available housing and public services for an illegal migration crisis that nobody in power wants to solve. It's all completely, utterly ridiculous. But that's an example of where housing is becoming a really big proxy, a really big symbol, a lightning rod of this bigger debate about what's happening to the country. So I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree with you. How do we make sure Labour's a one-term government? I would argue Labour are going to become a one-term government based on the decisions they're already making. They're kind of doing it for themselves. They're making these idiotic decisions around the economy. They're not resolving the issues that people care about. I know I sound like a broken record, but immigration is the number one issue facing the country. They have said next to nothing about that. The one chart in the OBR report on the budget, which I tweeted out, was absolutely mind-boggling, where you look at the kind of migration coming in and worker visas. If you go to my Twitter, you'll find it. It's just, I think I tweeted it yesterday. The number of worker visas is kind of like this. The number of student visas is like this. And then the number of dependent visas for relatives of migrants is like this. So, it's about, of all the visas we're giving out, about 15% are going to high-skilled workers, again, skilled workers, about 15%. The rest are going to sort of, just dependents of workers, students, or refugees, asylum seekers. It's a completely bonkers strategy and policy. So by not fixing those issues, Labour are setting themselves up to fail anyway. The issue then is, well, what is going to be the opposition to that Labour government? What is going to be the main opposition? And that is where the battle is. The one thing I know is we can't have people breaking off and allowing this nightmare and shit show to become a two-term government. The country, I don't think, would be able to survive that. If there were mass protests against the Labour government, would Starmer decide it's far-right terrorism and try to get the police to arrest everybody? I don't like to speculate about civil unrest. Yet at the same time, I don't think it would be at all surprising within the next few years for Britain to have significant community disorder and unrest relating to the decisions that are being taken by this Labour government. I really think the summer reflected the mood in the country among many people, a palpable sense of frustration and anger and desperation about where these policy decisions are taking us. And I don't like to be gloomy and apocalyptic, but there is a social contract in this country that is visibly breaking down. And a lot of people have sensed that. And that is what I think led so many people onto the streets, and is why in the polling, again, something that when I debated Nick Robinson and Mehdi Hassan, none of them wanted to talk about it. But if you look at what ordinary Brits thought about the protests, not the rioting, not the criminality, but the actual protests, between 40 and 60% of Brits said, yeah, they've got a point. That's basically the mood range in the country. Between 40 and 60% said, if you're peacefully protesting, if you're standing up, peacefully protesting against mass migration, broken borders, radical Islamism, child sexual exploitation at the hands of Pakistani Muslim gangs, if you're protesting that, millions of people in this country are thinking, well, you've got a point. And that is a reflection of the mood out there in the country. And it's sometimes you don't really kind of sense it. You're going about your day. We're all in different parts of the country or different countries around the world. It's difficult for people to sense that, but there is a palpable desperation setting in. So yeah, I definitely think that's right. We've got a question here. Do you have any idea what the 5-year Labour plan could be? Yeah, I mean, economically, what we're seeing is a big sugar rush. So massive splurge on borrowing, raising tax, chucking money at the NHS without really reforming it, chucking money at public services without worrying about productivity, absolutely at ease with mass migration, no real interest in pushing back against this kind of radical woke progressivism. If anything, they're going to accelerate it. Just a kind of mixture of sort of, left identity politics merged with sort of big stuff. Ways of life, a kind of culture of repudiation, basically. We're going to see the sort of mainstreaming of the woke radical gender stuff in schools, no matter what they're saying with regards to the NHS. You're going to see the public institutions tilt a bit more in that direction. And we're going to have this kind of big tax, big state, top down, big regulation economy where businesses are going to feel suffocated and completely stifled. And if you look at the news over the last 48 hours, I've heard hairdressers, I've heard big supply chains, computer companies, farms. I've heard a lot of people basically saying, well, some of these tax changes are already putting us out of business. So I think there is loosely a 5-year plan, but I don't think to be really honest, I just don't think they have the political intelligence and sophistication to think through where they want to be in 28, 29. Maybe they've got a sense of it, but I don't think it's realistic. I don't think it's particularly in touch with reality, because all the numbers we have suggest we're going to be in a kind of 1% growth rate with massive amounts of debt, maybe some kind of civil disorder, ongoing communalism, the rise of sectarianism. Much of this will be inflamed if the Middle East doesn't find its way to some sort of new status quo. And so I guess I'm being quite gloomy today. I'm trying not to be. But yeah, I don't think the 5-year plan is going to make us particularly happy and content. We've had a question about Europe changing migration policy. Does it mean more people will end up in the UK? Well, no, unless the Labour government sign us up to some kind of pan-European scheme. Now, one of the interesting things, by the way, is I'm now hearing Labour politicians saying, well, the answer to our illegal migration crisis is to go back into the European Union and rely on the Dublin Agreement, which is absolutely bananas, because when we were in the Dublin Agreement, more refugees and illegal migrants were transferred into the UK than were transferred out. So we're not doing that. I mean, it makes no sense. What you're seeing in Europe is what you're not seeing in the UK. There's a kind of irony. We've voted for Brexit so we could be a self-governing, independent, sovereign nation with control over our own borders. Ha, ha, ha. Still waiting for that one to turn up. But at the same time, it's actually Europe that's moving into a more pro-nation state sovereignty type position, where you've got, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Greece, Hungary, all now Austria, the election recently, the first party in Europe to win an election with remigration in the manifesto, basically saying it's time to start deporting people. That party's now being cut out of government, as usual, despite winning the election. That's not a sustainable strategy, but that's what's happening. So all of those countries now saying, actually, we need to start removing people, particularly, Syrians, people from Afghanistan who are committing, violent offences, and starting to say the big decision of 2015, Angela Merkel, we can do this. Let's open our borders without any plan for how we're going to manage this. The consensus in Sweden, in Germany, is now that was a complete disaster. It hasn't worked. Geert Wilders in the Netherlands has just unveiled a whole new suite of policy measures for cutting down on immigration, cutting down on radical Islam. Sweden is moving sharply to the right, abandoning its previous liberal position. And as a consequence, we are now the outlier. Right? We now have a Labour government that's kind of got no interest in doing this, unless it wants a Rwanda scheme for Chagos, but that's a different issue. We have a Labour government that actually has no serious interest in creating the active deterrent that we would need to deal with this issue. So I'm being slightly facetious. Maybe there's a conservative case for looking at the European Union for some more interesting policy ideas on migration. But I hope that will begin to influence our national debate here in Britain. The other thing, by the way, is if Trump wins on Tuesday, there is a clear message for Europe and for Britain. He will have won on the back of promising deportations. Now, JD Vance was asked about this. We've had a number of people who've been asked about this. Robert Jenrick, Nigel Farage, JD Vance. Nigel Farage was quite, in an interview with Stephen Edgington, was fairly skeptical about the idea. I don't think that interview actually fairly gave expression to what Nigel Farage thinks about that issue, but it was a little bit skeptical. Robert Jenrick has been, trying to sort of outflank reform on that issue. The most interesting answer to that question, though, well, okay, what would you do with deportations? The most interesting answer came from JD Vance in the US. He said, well, it's entirely logical. Firstly, you begin with foreign national offenders in prisons, 11,000 of those in the UK. Then you move on to foreign nationals convicted of crime who have been, broken our laws. Foreign nationals who have entered the country illegally. In the UK, if you look at the Pew estimates, that's somewhere between 1.2 and 1.7 million people. And what JD Vance said is, before you even get into any other issue, let's start with those groups. And I think if you looked at the issue through that lens, you would find the vast majority of people would say, yeah, okay, actually, I think on balance, those people probably shouldn't be in our society. Which is one of the reasons why, by the way, I push quite hard for dual nationals who have been involved in the grooming scandal, who are British and Pakistani, to be deported out of the country. You might remember that stack last year. That ended up being pushed by Robert Jenrick in his leadership election campaign, which was good to see. Before that, though, it was actually in Reform's manifesto, which again was good to see. We can apply pressure to these countries. We say, look, we're not going to give you we're not going to give you £500 million in aid, and we're not going to give you visas. We're going to use the visa program and international aid to say, you've got to take these people back. And if you don't, sorry, we're playing hardball. There are lots of things you can do around that. Now, listen, we've come to the end of the session, but just to say, Archie's asked me to remind you all that in the coming days, the Live with Matt podcast, these sessions are now available on Spotify and Apple, but long after we've had this discussion, so you're well ahead of the curve by joining us on the Fridays. We're going to have a one-off on Tuesday ahead of the US presidential election, just as we're getting ready to go into that pivotal election. So there'll be another live on Tuesday. As I said at the beginning, we've got only about 10 invitations left, 10 spots left at the Christmas party. And we've hit the 75,000 on YouTube. So if you're not liking and subscribing to us on YouTube, that's all completely free, by the way. Do like and subscribe there, because we're changing, helping to change a conversation there too. I think the live on Tuesday with the US will go about, it'll be between 7 and 8 p.m. I'll be doing some stuff on TV at about 9, but the live will be about between 7 and 8 p.m. We'll go through all the polling, what to expect, all the policies, the differences between Trump and Harris. Otherwise, keep your eyes on the national campaign today. I think it's going to be really exciting. Hopefully, it's going to get some cut through. We can't change the government, but we can remind the government as to what people care about and what they deserve to have access to. And piece by piece, it's about building an argument. It's about putting together evidence for why these disastrous policies that we're all having to pay the consequences of and live with the consequences of have to come to an end. And we're doing it piece by piece. Lastly, I will be speaking at the Reform Conference in Wales and Exeter next week, next Friday and Saturday. I will be giving keynote speeches at those conferences. I may see some of you there. Bye-bye.